RFK Jr. is most certainly the breakout star in independent circles during the 2024 election season, and people on both sides of the aisle have taken a fascination to him, particularly due to his stance on vaccines and his skepticism towards the general medical narrative on particular issues. Now, personally, I have never been fascinated with RFK Jr. I believe that he still endorses many aspects of the socialist project, which violates the American ethos, and I believe that he still believes the government has too much of a active role to be played in American life, so on and so forth. Plus, he's not radical enough in what he is willing to do to reform the sort of fourth branch of government that has been spawned from hundreds of years of progressive jurisprudence and legislation and court rulings and executive orders that has created this monster that has effectively rotted the American system from the inside out. But having said that, he certainly is someone that stands outside of the Overton window, and he provides some necessary pushback to the establishment's talking points. Now, he was recently on CNN with Aaron Burnett, and he made a statement that I thought was rather startling and also concerning, because a lot of people, including a lot of conservative influencers, ate it up like candy. I didn't, because I'll explain why I didn't do it, but I was terribly concerned. And so I'm going to play what he said, and then I'm going to challenge his assertion for a moment here. Go.
But do you really believe that when people talk about the threat to democracy that Trump poses, do you really think that is an equal evil to Biden?
I mean, listen, I can make the argument that President Biden is a much worse threat to democracy. And the reason for that is President Biden is the first candidate in history, the first president in history that has used the federal agencies to censor political speech, so to censor his opponent. I can say that because I just won a case in the Federal Court of Appeals and now before the Supreme Court that shows that he started censoring not just me. 37 hours after he took the oath of office, he was censoring me. No president in the country has ever done that. The greatest threat to democracy is not somebody who questions election returns, but a president of the United States who used the power of his office to force the social media companies, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, to open a portal and give access to that portal to the FBI, to the CIA, to the IRS, to CISA, to NIH, to censor his political critics. President Biden, for the first president in history, to use his power over the Secret Service to deny Secret Service protection to one of his political opponents for political reasons. He's weaponizing the federal agencies. Those are really critical threats to democracy. Trump, of course.
Okay, he's claiming that Joe Biden is the first president in history to try to censor political speech or to try to censor an opponent's political speech. Now, the question I wish to ask all of you before we explore it is very simple. Is Joe Biden the first president in American history to actively weaponize the government against his political opponents to shut them down? And secondly, is Joe Biden the most tyrannical president in American history, or the first president in American history to exercise tyrannical powers in this kind of way? If you were to accept the RFK Jr. assertion, it would appear that he most certainly is. But history actually has a much different story to tell. Let me take you guys back through the past of American history so we can establish a single truth. Joe Biden is not the originator of the tyranny of the executive branch as it relates to American politics. He is instead one single person in a long tradition of executive tyranny that spans all the way back to the days of Abraham Lincoln. This is not to say that Biden is not tyrannical. Evidently, trying to force a medicine on people, on millions of Americans, by means of occupational safety fiat is not at all, it's not at all respecting of Americans' rights. It's evidently tyrannical. Obviously, there are plenty of reasons to believe that he is not a good person or good president. But more on that later. So let's go back to the presidency of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who occupies this place in the canon of American presidents, this almost mythologized podium where he is said to be the president that actually helped us through World War II. Well, that's not necessarily even the case, but I'll accept the conventional definition for a moment. FDR had nothing but venom, hatred, and foul thoughts about his opponents both in politics and in the media. FDR not only weaponized the government against these people, He weaponized particular agencies against some of these people in order to throw them off balance. For example, Huey Long. Now, Huey Long is a name that has kind of been forgotten to the past, but Huey Long was the former governor of Louisiana. He was a populist socialist who was incredibly popular with the population of Louisiana. He was a progressive, and so he was very much in the camp of FDR, although he had a much more radical and less establishmentarian posture as opposed to FDR. Well, FDR saw this guy from Louisiana who became a United States Senator from Louisiana and began to challenge him on the national stage. FDR saw Huey Long as a threat. So FDR sent the IRS against Huey Long to investigate him, investigate his associates, and sent, as Long himself noted, hundreds of IRS agents down to Louisiana to intimidate, harass, and indict people who were on Long's payroll or who were in Long's orbit. Indeed, many of the cases that the IRS brought forth against these people were either thrown out for being bogus, settled, or even worse, they were gotten rid of on the condition that the individual that the IRS was looking at would support a Roosevelt second term over a Huey Long presidency because Huey Long was running for president. Oh, he didn't just target Huey Long. FDR also targeted the media. During World War II, FDR made these constant proclamations to the American public that their duties had to lie with the government and with the war effort and with the American view of the entire going on of world events. You may have seen that very famous poster, "If you're riding alone, you're riding with Hitler," which simply meant if you were in a car alone and you weren't supporting rationing efforts at that time, you were somehow supporting Hitler. Only propaganda and a foul use of language and moral sentiment can convince someone that by acting in their legitimate powers as a moral agent, by fulfilling the practice of their private property, they are somehow aligned with evil. And yet that is the delusion that FDR put Americans under during his time as president during World War II. FDR established the Office of Wartime Information, which was a propaganda firm which specifically attacked and directed sentiments towards certain individuals who were critical of the war effort. FDR also had particular people, such as, for example, reporters in the Chicago Tribune, surveilled and harassed due to the fact that they did not support his war effort, and they publicized their discontent in the opinion columns of their newspaper. Indeed, he had his opponents in the press monitored, meaning he went to his attorney general, and he had them monitored and surveilled. Not only that, but he had those same opponents, quite literally, investigated on charges of being sympathetic towards Nazis and fascists. And of course, those investigations went nowhere because the charges were bogus, but still, he directed his FBI and the other asses of the government to go in and investigate those charges meticulously to the point where it would fundamentally chill speech. FDR also tried to indict reporters who were speaking out against America's involvement in World War II under the Espionage Act, which is an act we have seen abused many times in many contemporary cases against people who are political dissidents. Not only that, but FDR wrote to Winston Churchill, the so-called great leader of the West, great leader of Britain. And when he caught wind of the fact that an American newspaper that was critical towards his war effort was seeking a license to publish in England, FDR wrote to Churchill and said, "Do not approve their license." And what did Churchill do? He smiled and said, "Of course, they will not be published because they go against the narrative we're trying to push." I'm paraphrasing, but that is essentially what their correspondence said. I'll have a link to their letters, their correspondence in the comment section down below. Speaking of FDR, his treatment of the Reverend Charles Coughlin also comes to mind. Let me preface this. Reverend Charles Coughlin was a horrifically anti-Semitic, vicious, Nazi-sympathizing, horrid kind of person. He's not someone who I would like. He's not someone who I would sympathize with, and if I ever saw him in real life, I would have very harsh words for him were he still living. But free speech is not just free, it is not free. It comes at a cost. And the cost is going to be not just having other views that may be dangerous to certain other viewpoints. The cost is also going to be your own comfort. Everyone, including those who are hateful and spiteful, should have free speech. This is a basic American birthright. But FDR didn't think so, which is why FDR used the broadcast licensing system apparatus of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and he used it to change the terms of broadcast licensing to shut down Coughlin's very popular radio show, which drew in millions of people every single day because Coughlin was critical of the war effort. But FDR, I'm not going to pick on him. He's just one president in this whole corpus of presidents that have created and fomented this culture of weaponization of government and tyranny that we now see on full display in the Biden administration, and so on and so forth. Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of the most devilish men to ever occupy the Oval Office, he had both the CIA and the FBI surveil the campaign offices of his political opponent in the 60s, Senator Barry Goldwater, who, by the way, was a wonderful visionary of America, a great person. I have spoken at the Goldwater Institute, which was founded in his namesake. I have met his son. I think he is one of the unsung heroes of America and one of the reasons why we produced that Reagan Revolution, which in many ways moved the country forward towards a more positive vision. Of course, it had downsides, but you take the good and the bad together and you try to make something out of it. But the CIA had an operative inserted into Barry Goldwater's office, and the CIA director at the time actually admitted this is happening in front of a Senate Investigatory Committee. And the FBI also assisted in this illegal surveillance, all upon the orders of Lyndon Baines Johnson. It got so bad that Goldwater's campaign staff had to use payphones, and they had to speak in certain ways that were mysterious in order to diffuse the effectiveness of government censorship and government monitoring of their totally legal campaign activities. I can go on. Abraham Lincoln shut down newspapers and persecuted people who wrote bad things against his initiatives in office in the name of keeping the Union strong. The truth is this. Oh, how can I forget? John F. Kennedy, RFK Jr.'s uncle. John F. Kennedy quite literally used the IRS to revoke the tax status of several different organizations who he deemed to be right-wing and extremist, and particularly ones that criticized him for being a Roman Catholic. Indeed, JFK established the agency within the IRS, the Ideological Organizations Audit Project, and it targeted 22 extremist groups, several of whom lost their tax-exempt status, presumably due to the fact that they were incredibly vocal and opposing JFK's presidency and JFK's status as a Catholic. In fact, Kennedy himself said at a press conference about this particular issue, I quote, "I don't think that the federal government can interfere or should interfere with the right of any individual to take any position he wants." He goes on, "The only thing we should be concerned about is that it does not represent a diversion of funds which might be taxable. I am sure the Internal Revenue System examines that." Whenever a tyrant or an authoritarian or a politician whose actions are bound by the norms of power, are divorced from first principles, and are more worried about the temporal furtherance of their political goals at the expense of all morality and all sound thinking, whenever they see fit to make use of one of their tools in a way that is not good, they will always provide a pretense. They will always provide some kind of false justification for doing what they are doing, and they will do so almost always in the name of safety or benevolence. This is why the term national security has been invoked in this country, in America, post-1950s, to justify some of the most egregious rights violations known to the history of our country in recent times, and also justify them in the name of safety, despite the fact that they fundamentally endanger rights. Isn't it funny how safety is almost always seen in terms of physical phenomenon, how it's almost always seen in terms of guns and troops and police and government spending, but what's not focused on are the things that the increase of a government presence does to the rights of the individual they're supposed to protect. It actually violates them. But when safety is talked about, that angle is never discussed. Isn't that interesting? When many Americans have a single-track mind, and our politicians are counting on us to have a single-track mind when it comes to this stuff. My friends, I give this history to you not to try to be an apologist for Biden. Obviously, Biden is one of the worst presidents we've had in modern history on both an economic level and administrative level and just so many ways in terms of tact, what have you. But I do show it to you to say that our political conversation and our wisdom as Americans suffers for a lack of knowledge. It suffers from only considering the past 4 years, or the past 8 years, or the past 12 years as the whole of political history, and then using that very limited sample to draw general conclusions like RFK Jr. did in that interview with Aaron Burnett. When we do that, we are fundamentally disconnected from the past, which then means the quality of our knowledge and thereby the quality of our observations and the solutions to the problems that we will have to our modern society, they will become inferior in quality. They will be narrowed and limited in scope, and we may not find the best answer that we need at this point to beat back many of the issues we're facing as Americans in our new era. RFK Jr. is most certainly, compared to what we have been getting for the past few years, a breath of fresh air. Even though his ideology is incorrect, even though a lot of his policies don't go far enough, even though I'm not necessarily crazy about the Kennedy dynasty returning to politics, even though all that's true, he still fights the establishment in some way. But just because he is a useful utility against the establishment in some way does not mean we should compromise the quality of our ability to learn, think, and do as Americans, and to approach our political conversation with the utmost respect that it deserves. It deserves more from all of us as Americans. Our country deserves more from all of us as Americans. There has been a culture of tyranny spanning back decades that Biden simply inherits. To be honest with you, he's not even the best tyrant out of all of those I mentioned. LBJ is probably the best one. Maybe even FDR. Because when you can convince people that exercising their basic rights is evil, oh my gosh, which FDR did, then oh my gosh, you've done something that is absolutely astronomically difficult to imagine would ever happen to the American tradition, which was so hell-bent on resisting authoritarianism in the rhetoric of the authoritarians that we fought against to be liberated from in the 1770s. Biden doesn't even come close to FDR in terms of his effectiveness. But he does come close to FDR in terms of his odiousness. Evil is evil no matter who does it. Let's not deceive ourselves that Biden's the first or the worst. Let's just understand that Biden is simply one pawn in a long game of chess that has been screwing over both you and me. And the only way we get through it is by studying history, studying philosophy, remaining morally convicted, and staying pensive. My friends, I love you guys so much. And as I mentioned, please stay pensive. Bye, guys.